Big news in MH370 world with the announcement that the Malaysian government has okayed an agreement with the seabed search firm Ocean Infinity to restart the search for the missing plane. The question we're going to ask today is, where are they going to look and why are they doing this now? Okay, let's start with a little context. As viewers of the podcast will well know by now, the seabed search for MH370 originally started in late 2014 when search officials hired a Dutch marine survey company called Fugro to carry out a side scan sonar search of the seabed in the southern Indian Ocean. The search area was defined using a mathematical technique called Bayesian inference to define where along the seventh final arc of the Inmarsat transmissions the plane was most likely when it sent its final transmission. We talked about this in episode 11 of season 1 and episode 2 of season 2. They also calculated how far from the seventh arc the plane could have glided, as we discussed in episode 12 of season 1 and episode 4 of season 2. Together, these calculations resulted in a probability distribution of where the signals suggested the plane should be. Search officials then drew a box around the area where the density was highest and figured that there was a 97% chance that the plane would be somewhere in that box. However, they searched the box, the plane wasn't there. So they doubled the size of the box and they still didn't find it. They called off the search. Australia issued its final report on the accident and the whole thing was done and dusted. They'd searched 120,000 square kilometers. And they said at the end, there's one more small area that we could search. It might be there, but we basically ran out of money. We ran out of time. Sorry, we just couldn't do it. And that would have been the end of it. But the following year, a private company called Ocean Infinity stepped forward and offered to continue the search on their own dime. They just wanted to be paid if they found it. And Malaysia thought about it, said, okay, that's a good deal. And so Ocean Infinity restarted the search. And they wound up searching another 120,000 square kilometers. So at this point, as I've often said, an area the size of Great Britain has been scanned. No plane. They just didn't find it. So Ocean Infinity gave up too. And really, at this point, there was no particular reason to keep searching the seabed because there was no analytical basis. If, like the Australians and Malaysians, you believe in your heart of hearts that there's no conceivable way that anyone other than the pilot could have taken the plane, therefore it must be in the Southern Ocean, but you can't really come up with a story that makes sense that will give you anywhere in particular to look. You have to assume that whatever occurred was just such a random sequence of inexplicable events that you can't really predict anywhere to look. So for many years, the state of affairs was that Malaysia said that the case wasn't totally closed. It would support a new search, but only if new and credible information became available. And frankly, that just hasn't happened. From time to time, some random person will come forward with some new theory or claim, but it's never really added up to anything. And yet, in late 2023, Malaysian Transport Minister Anthony Loke starts talking about reaching an agreement with Ocean Infinity to restart the seabed search. There are a few news stories about that. Again, on the 10th anniversary in March of 2024, he makes more noises along these lines. There are a few more news stories, then it goes quiet again. Finally, on December 20th, 2024, he holds a press conference and he says this.
The Cabinet has agreed in principle to accept the proposal from Ocean Infinity United Kingdom to proceed with seabed search operations to locate the wreckage of flight MH370 in a new area estimated at 15,000 square kilometers in the southern Indian Ocean. This endeavor will be based on the no fine, no fee principle. Under this principle, the Malaysian government will not be required to pay Ocean Infinity any fees unless the wreckage of the aircraft is discovered. The proposed new search area, identified by Ocean Infinity, is based on the latest information and data analysis conducted by experts and researchers. The company's proposal is credible and merits further examination by the Malaysian government as a state of registration for MH370. The Ministry of Transport is currently negotiating the terms and conditions of the agreement with Ocean Infinity, which is expected to be finalized in early 2025. These decisions reflect the Malaysian government's commitment to continuing the search operation and providing closure for the families of MH370 passengers. Thank you.
When will this happen? According to other news sources, Ocean Infinity has indicated that January to April is the best period for the search. So for me, Loke's announcement is a very typical MH370 story in a way, in that it raises more questions than it answers. Loke says they'll spend up to $70 million to scan 15,000 square kilometers in 18 months. Remember that the last time Ocean Infinity conducted a search, it covered more than 120,000 square kilometers, or 8 times as much, in 4 months for the same amount of money. Now they've decided that they're going to go look in a fairly small, very specific area, which suggests that they think they have some information that is very credible and specific about where the plane went. So why do they need so much time and so much money? So for me, the 2 biggest mysteries of the announcement are, first of all, where are they going to look? And secondly, why are they doing this now? For years, Malaysia has said that they will only restart the search if there's new and credible information. And I personally have heard nothing that would fit that bill. But what would Malaysia have heard that it might think fits that bill, that maybe will give us a clue as to where they're going to look? And I have 2 ideas about this. The first has to do with work carried out by Victor Ianello, who I've mentioned many times in this podcast, along with some other members of the independent group. In March of 2024, Victor wrote on his blog, and I quote, MH370 family member VPR Nathan presented several slides highlighting Ocean Infinity's willingness to conduct another subsea search for the debris fields of the aircraft. The search area, which may be refined later, extends along the 7th arc from about 33 degrees south to 36 degrees south and out to about 45 nautical miles, or 83 kilometers, on either side of the arc. Ocean Infinity also plans to fill in areas that were previously searched that had low quality or missing data due to equipment failures or challenging terrain. The proposal is broadly consistent with the flight reconstruction and recommended search area that we presented in UGIB 2020. This is a paper that Victor and his colleagues wrote, and the subsequent drift study. Okay. Basically, if you look at the BTO data through the lens of Bayesian analysis and also consider things like the aircraft performance and drift modeling, this is a very reasonable place to look. Here's the thing, though. We've known that this is a reasonable place to look for a very long time. This area was searched in the original Fugro seabed scan, and it was searched further by Ocean Infinity. So there's no new reason to look here. The logic is just, look, this is where the data says the plane went. If we didn't find it and the previous 2 searches, either it must have gone into a crevice or it glided further from the 7th arc. If you'll recall, there's this idea that if the plane, after the plane ran out of fuel and went into this steep and accelerating dive, maybe the pilot changed his mind, put it into a glide, went very far from the 7th arc, and then changed his mind again and slammed it into the ocean, creating the debris patterns that we've seen on the pieces that have been collected in the Western Indian Ocean. Okay, so why the pilot would have done this, we have no idea, but that's what it would have taken to get the plane far enough from the 7th arc that we wouldn't have found it by now. Remember, if it was Zahari doing this, he would have had no idea about the Inmarsat data or how the search would later be calculated. So he couldn't have been trying to evade getting found. It was all just blind luck that this happened to happen. if this happened at all. So this is the state of the theory that would lead you to look in this particular area, which Victor seems to think Ocean Infinity is planning to do. This line of reasoning will get you a fairly specific area to search in. But the question is, if you've known all of this for years, why have you decided to look there now? There's an alternative explanation for why Malaysia is restarting the search. And this, for me, is a bit scarier. Okay, as you'll recall, in recent years, a former IG member named Richard Godfrey has been spreading the claim that he has invented a new method for detecting airplanes in flight using historical ham radio data called Whisper. Godfrey and I go way back. We were both founding members of the independent group, and he was one of the leading voices demanding that I get kicked out for suggesting that the plane could have been hacked. He remained very active in the group. He was really one of the leading lights. He was thanked by name by the ATSB in their final report in 2017. And he was one of Victor Ianello's co-authors on the 2020 report that I was just reading about. So he's very much a guy who enjoys the respect of the establishment. And yet he's really also something of a loose cannon. I remember back in the days when I was still in the IG and still taking part in these discussions, he was forever coming up with wild claims that people would scratch their heads at. Like he would generate a route using BTO data and say, this is where the plane went, overlooking the fact that there was essentially an infinite number of courses and routes that were equally valid. And he would just make the claim and try to make it stick just by the force of his conviction. As the years went by, his behavior got more erratic, in my estimation. He collaborated on projects with Blaine Gibson, who we've talked about in episode 21 of season 1, and also with another loose cannon named Jeffrey Thomas. But he's probably best known amongst the general public for an idea that is incredibly bonkers and also incredibly influential. It's called Whisper. I talked about this in episode 28 of season 1. Godfrey claims that by sifting through this historical radio data, he can trace the path of MH370 in minute detail, and that it winds up creating a track like this. I think it should be fairly intuitively obvious that jet planes do not fly like this. Also, from a Bayesian standpoint, it is vanishingly unlikely that you would weave around the sky like this and just by chance produce a set of ping rings that just happen to match those that would be produced by a jet flying straight and fast in the normal manner. But what I think is really important to understand is that Godfrey's claims, which he has laid out in a very long and technically detailed white papers, is 100% pure poppycock. It is nonsense. I'm not going to try to explain it in detail because you can't really explain gibberish. But let me quote Joe Taylor, the Nobel Prize winning physicist who invented Whisper originally. He wrote in an email to Mike Exner, quote, "I was not aware of these references to Whisper data. I have not read the papers or the Godfrey blog, and I am not going to waste my time on them. But yes, if you think a public quote would do any good, you may use this one. I do not believe that historical data from the Whisper network can provide any information useful for aircraft tracking." Taylor later gave an even more pointed quote to Victor Ianello saying, quote, "As I've written several times before, it's crazy to think that historical Whisper data could be used to track the course of ill-fated flight MH370, or for that matter, any other aircraft flight. I don't choose to waste my time arguing with pseudoscientists who don't understand what they are doing." Victor has published a rather long technical blog post debunking Godfrey's Whisper claims. I appreciate him doing that. Again, I don't think you can really argue against nonsense. Frankly, I was amazed that the independent group kicked me out for suggesting that MH370 could have been cyber hijacked, which by now we know multiple cybersecurity experts say is valid, at least as a possibility. But they had no problem with Godfrey making claims that are so outlandish that, frankly, I think that they can only be characterized as deliberate lies, because he must know better. He must know what he's doing. And I was so kind of outraged by this, frankly, that I went and I asked Mike Exner via DM on Twitter about this. I asked him, how come you kicked me out and you didn't kick Godfrey out? And he wrote, quote, he hasn't been part of the IG for about 5 years now. This was earlier in 2024. Not only for the ridiculous whisper theory, but also the insane trunnion gear door theory. I'm not actually familiar with that. And other disproven claims. He is mentally ill. Mike Exner is saying that Richard Godfrey is mentally ill. Okay. Now, frankly, I found this quite astonishing, because while my eviction from the IG was quite public, I've never heard that the IG kicked Godfrey out. In fact, as I said, Victor Ianello was collaborating with him as recently as 2020 on that paper that I mentioned earlier. Godfrey still has a high degree of credibility in the public sphere, in large part because of the endorsement not only of people like the IG, but also government officials. For instance, after he came out with the whisper theory, journalists approached the ATSB for comment, and they put out a statement that read in part, and I'm going to read again, quote, the ATSB is aware of the work of Mr. Richard Godfrey and acknowledges that he is a credible expert on the subject of MH370, but the ATSB does not have the technical expertise to and has not been requested to review his MH370 flight path paper and workings. As such, the ATSB cannot offer an assessment of the validity of Mr. Godfrey's work using whisper data, said ATSB Chief Commissioner Angus Mitchell. So this is the highest levels of an Australian government body essentially endorsing Godfrey, if not for this particular claim, for his work in general, and saying he's a respected guy. And we respect him. We as a government body are going to put our imprimatur of approval on Richard Godfrey. And what's worse, Godfrey's work has been boosted significantly on social media and YouTube, perhaps nowhere more influentially than by the popular aviation YouTuber Mentor Pilot, who included this segment in his wildly popular episode on MH370 that so far has gotten 5.5 million views.
Back in 2021, an avionics system engineer called Richard Godfrey started exploring the possibility of using the Whisper database together with algorithms to look for anomalies in several different simultaneous transmissions as a kind of poor man's primary radar. Theoretically, if you know the exact location of the transmitter and the receiver, together with the time of day and about 1 million other factors, there might be a possibility to use tiny concurring anomalies in several of these signals to track something like an aircraft. And the really cool thing is that this technology samples thousands of signals every 2 minutes, which could potentially give us much more information than we previously had. Godfrey understood this, and from 2021 until today, he and his colleagues, Dr. Hannes Coetze and Professor Simon Maskell, have been trying to analyze this database to try and find traces of MH370. And in a report released on the 31st of August 2023, they claim that they have actually done just that. Again, this video is not about whether this technology actually can be used this way or not, but what I find fascinating here is that it's based on verifiable stored data. So just like with DNA that couldn't be used much during the early years but has since been refined to incredible accuracy, maybe there actually is something hidden inside of these signals. This team's trace data have actually already improved significantly from their first results as their algorithms have been evolving, and this latest report tells a quite fascinating story. Initially, the Whisper data coincided nicely with the existing radar information up until just prior to Vampy, where it indicated that the aircraft made a turn to a more westerly heading.
And there's more, it goes on, but I think you get the point. You know, I think it's really remarkable that Mentor Pilot says first of all, we don't really know if this data can be used in this way. And then he goes ahead and he treats it as fact. I find this all incredibly depressing. To be sure, many people disagree about my analysis of MH370 evidence, but I have tried to be careful and open-minded because I truly think that the only way that human beings can make collective sense of the world that they live in is by being careful, meticulous, and above all, honest. We have to operate in good faith. My particular assessment of the case might not be right, but I firmly believe that this communal, scientific, good faith approach is the only way forward. It's the only way we can understand what is happening. And in the case of Richard Godfrey, I see a person who has deliberately poisoned the discussion with lies. And no one has called him out on it. The independent group hasn't, the ATSB hasn't, not a single journalist has. And so to finally get where I was going with all this, my great fear is that Ocean Infinity and the Malaysian government are going to put their reputations behind endorsing Godfrey's idea and search where his whispered hoax says the plane went, which is considerably further north than what Victor Ianello has proposed and much more unlikely from a Bayesian standpoint. But if we're talking about ideas that are new, it's definitely newer than what Victor is proposing. If the Malaysians decide to endorse this idea, all of the family members and the millions of members of the public who deeply care about this case will just be led further away into misinformation and confusion. And we'll collectively find ourselves that much further away from figuring out this mystery, which, as I've said so many times, I think this is absolutely essential and crucial that we do. And that's a depressing take, but there's an optimistic take too. And that's that this renewal of the seabed search could reawaken the interest of the public and the media to take another look at the mystery. And I'm hoping that I can use this occasion to make a point, which is that a seabed search can be thought of as a test of a hypothesis, namely the hypothesis that the plane flew into the southern Indian Ocean. That hypothesis predicts that the plane will be found. On the other hand, if the plane isn't there, then by the principles of Bayesian analysis, that is evidence that the plane is not in the southern Indian Ocean. And when we have those results in hand, it should be incumbent on all officials and well-informed observers to ask themselves, how can we explain the evidence? How can we use what we've learned? How could it be possible that the plane isn't in the southern Indian Ocean? What haven't we considered? Because as you know, once they start asking those questions, there is a lot of very interesting things that they will learn.